Thank God I was able to go to the US and see a specialist. What they did for me prevented me from waiting until my death in Canada. Because here you just wait and wait and wait. And if it's not active and it's not eating you alive, they put you on the back burner. And I couldn't afford to be on the back burner. I had to save myself.
Today at secondstreet.org, we're talking with Chris Vander Doelen from Harrow, Ontario, who had to travel to the United States to receive a special PET scan for prostate cancer, which he could not receive here in Canada. Chris credits the Los Angeles hospital with saving his life. Why do so many Canadians have to travel abroad for healthcare? We're going to explore this troubling problem.
My name is Chris Vander Doelen. I live in Harrow, Ontario. I found out about my cancer after a regular checkup. I'd gone to my GP of 30 years, and he's sort of looking at his clipboard, and he said, oh, you're 51 now. It's time to start doing PSA tests, don't you think? So he sent me for the PSA test. And about a week later, I got a call that he didn't like the number. So I think it was within a year that they told me, well, we need to do a biopsy to find out if it's really cancer or not, because there are other reasons why your PSA can be high. So they did a biopsy, and it turned out that, in fact, I did have prostate cancer.
Chris was put on a waiting list for surgery. Fortunately, he didn't have to wait too long because his hometown is very close to the US border, and many patients traveled to the United States for healthcare.
My first procedure, they told me I had to wait 6 months before I could get the radioactive seeds. And only a couple of weeks later, they called me back and said, oh, it's been moved up. And only 6 weeks later, I got my procedure. I said, what happened to all the other guys on the waiting list? And they kind of shrugged and said, he probably went to the States.
Chris received surgery at the Windsor Regional Hospital. Unfortunately, it was not successful. A small portion of cancer cells remained, meaning his life was still at risk.
So I would say it was 2 or 3 years after the procedure that I started to learn from my urologist that in fact I had not had a successful treatment and that cancer was still in my future. If it's not contained, it can get into your bones, it can get into your liver, it can get into your brain. That was the risk I was living with.
To avoid complicated and risky exploratory surgery, Chris required a special PET scan that was not available in Canada. Once he had the scan, he could provide the image to Canadian surgeons, and they could see exactly where the cancer was and remove it with as little risk to surrounding organs as possible. Chris's doctor recommended traveling to Los Angeles for the scan. He and his wife traveled to the United States shortly after.
You lay in this machine for 45 minutes, just like many of us have for one of these big scans, and you don't move. It's painless, it's simple. And at the end, it kicks out a highly detailed digital image. He mailed a CD of the results, one to me and one to my urologist. And then they started planning the next phase of my treatment.
The Windsor Hospital in Ontario was able to use the image Chris obtained from Los Angeles to pinpoint the remaining cancerous cells and successfully remove them from his prostate gland.
I sat in this waiting room with about 25 other people, and I was finally called in, and I could tell right away from the look on his face that it had been a success, because he was grinning, and this guy's got a big smile, and good news, he said, below detection levels. And I knew that he was also feeling the risk level of this and hoping it would work. So it was a bit of jubilation on both sides. I couldn't have been happier.
Statistics Canada data obtained by secondstreet.org showed Canadian patients made over 217,000 trips to other countries in 2017, specifically for healthcare. Secondstreet.org has spoken with patients who have traveled to China, Germany, Lithuania, Thailand, Mexico, the United States, and other countries for healthcare. One reason Canadians travel abroad for healthcare is because governments often make it extremely difficult for private surgical clinics in Canada to provide the same services as the public system. For example, the British Columbia government is currently in court trying to prevent private clinics in the province from selling surgeries to British Columbians. In Ontario, the government even prohibits private clinics from selling MRI scans to the public. This is why many Ontarians have to travel across the border to Buffalo for MRI scans. These types of government barriers force more patients to depend on the public healthcare system. This is one reason why Canada has really long waiting lists to meet with a specialist and to receive surgery. Consider all the developed countries that have these types of restrictions on private healthcare. Now consider developed countries that have both a universal healthcare system and private options. If governments in Canada remove barriers to private healthcare, then some patients would choose to go to private clinics. This would reduce waiting lists in the public system. It would give patients more choice. For example, a private clinic in Canada might offer new technology that is not available in the public system.
Looking back, my wife and I both feel that, if only we could have done this in Canada. Why are so many of us traveling to the US for healthcare and spending, I have no doubt, billions of dollars a year in the US purchasing needed procedures, needed healthcare? We could be spending that here. We could be employing healthcare people here.
To learn more about healthcare solutions, please visit secondstreet.org.